What would it take for you to believe that this is a suicide? For Martha Morgan's daughter, Denisa, that question may as well be a trick question. A question she says is impossible to directly answer now because of how poorly it was answered by police investigators on day one.
They strictly took his word.
The word of her father, Dennis Morgan, who tells police he found his wife's bloodied body just moments before calling 911.
911, what's your emergency? I don't know, my wife just committed suicide.
And unless Mr. Morgan were to walk into police headquarters and make another recording,
and short of a confession by Mr. Morgan, I can't see another reason for them to reopen the case.
You clearly see why investigators aren't willing to budge. Both sides dug in.
I found this a little bit strange.
One side, who's become a one-woman homicide department, compiling official reports, crime scene photos, and independent examinations.
I've got experts backing me up that it is a homicide.
And the other.
This probably is the largest file that I have in my 9 years as coroner, because we've reopened this case so many times.
Led by Caddo Parish Coroner Todd Toma.
My heart goes out to the family. It always has gone out to the family. But there has to be a time where you heal and you go on about your life.
Oh, she's bloody all over.
This battle between doubt and science, according to police reports, began here on Oleander Drive in Shreveport, February 19th, 2011, with a single gunshot that no one heard. Initial reports state after running a series of errands, Dennis Morgan returned home, worked in the yard, but then soon after opened the bedroom door.
She committed suicide. Okay, are you in there with her?
That word, suicide, begins a trail of doubt for Denisa.
They should have worked the crime scene. They did not put yellow crime tape out. They strictly took my father, who was a city worker's word for what happened.
A trail filled with repeated references to suicide.
Can you tell what she did to herself? My God, I don't even see a gun in us. I don't know what she did.
And the number 18.
Dispatch area 4 supervisor.
Go ahead.
Got an 18.
On radio traffic shortly after the 911 call, dispatch and officers begin referencing the call.
What you got over there? District 12, so 18.
Over and over.
Give me the address of that 18.
And over as 18.
Yes, ma'am. You can make the report made in that 18.
And according to this police code sheet provided by the Shreveport Police Department, an 18 is suicide.
911, what is your emergency?
And then for a second time, Dennis Morgan calls 911.
My wife committed suicide. You got anybody coming here?
Within minutes, suicide is referenced a half dozen times on the recordings alone. Denisa fears that set the suicide wheels in motion for all involved.
They did not treat it as you're supposed to. All gunshots are supposed to be treated as a homicide till proven otherwise.
Every case that we go into in a situation where there's a violent death like this, it's a homicide until proven otherwise.
But as Dr. Toma, at least on his end, that's anything but the truth.
And we work from there backwards. So we have to convince ourselves why this wasn't a homicide.
Dr. Toma processed the bloody scene with dozens of photos and discovered this .38 caliber handgun underneath Martha's body. And admittingly, by the time his work was done on Oleander Drive, Dr. Toma felt he already had his answer.
Once I left that scene, I felt very confident that it was a suicide. I could almost reconstruct, based on the forensic evidence and the scene evidence, how Mrs. Morgan sat on the edge of the bed with the purse next to her. The gun was probably in the purse. She proceeded to make the decision that she was going to commit suicide.
But what Dr. Toma theorizes happened after that shot is where Denisa's real struggle amplifies. He says the science tells him that after Martha shot herself, she didn't fall back, she didn't get up, she just sat there on the edge of that bed for a minute, maybe even as long as 2, bleeding to death.
When she finally lost enough blood, she lost consciousness and she fell on the floor. She fell on top of the weapon that was used.
Dr. Toma says the science shows Martha never made a run for it, as if she was trying to get away from an attacker. She sat there bleeding until passing out and eventually falling to the floor behind a closed door. Dr. Toma says his conclusion of suicide was further backed up by a phone call Denisa made herself just 2 months earlier, a call to the coroner's office to have her mother evaluated after stating she wanted to kill herself.
And she was honest that she made that one statement that she regretted saying.
Now, everyone agrees Martha was checked out at the hospital and released the same day. The diagnosis, adjustment disorder, brought on by too much stress.
That day he was pushing her, he was being verbally abusive, pushing her, threatening her.
Stress, Denisa says she personally witnessed for years and documented in police reports repeated claims of abuse by her mother Martha at the hands of her husband. You've witnessed him hitting her.
Several times.
Put a number to it.
Oh, God. If I took my whole entire life, it would be hundreds of times. And my
Hundreds of times that you've seen your dad hitting your mom, pushing your mom. So you tell the police all this, even the day of the suicide, that this is what I have witnessed hundreds of times. And at no time did you feel they thought it was anything but a suicide.
Right.
According to these police reports, officers took a statement from Dennis Morgan that day, February 19th, the day of Martha's death, right there on the scene. He provided an alibi of errands and raking leaves, although one officer did note he was relatively clean for having been working in the yard that day. And at least according to these records, there was no other contact made with Dennis Morgan again for another 3 months. That's when the lead investigator documented calling Dennis, reminding him that he's not a suspect, but asking him to come to headquarters to verify statements that he previously made. Dennis's response: "I'm tired of dealing with the situation and wish to be left alone." The last known contact between SPD and Mr. Morgan. Hey, Dennis Morgan, Doug Warner with KSLA in Shreveport. How are you? And when we tracked down Dennis Morgan by phone earlier this week, we were hoping you would allow us just to come talk to you and give you the final word on this whole thing. He didn't want to talk and promptly hung up.
When you look at the crime scene photos 37 and 38.
In the years since her mother's death, Denisa started gathering documents
And over, I've told them.
compiling her own case in hopes of proving her mother was murdered. And in the course of going through these police records, we also had questions for the lead investigator. In a series of 4 emails, I made requests for interviews in hopes of better understanding how the investigator concluded suicide. My requests were all declined by the lead investigator on this 2011 case, Detective Marcus Hines.
I personally never seen a wreck this bad.
Ironically, the same Marcus Hines who is now the lead spokesperson on SPD cases, a role he transitioned into just months after Martha's death. Do you think it's a fair question, though, for me to ask a police investigator how they arrived at suicide just in the name of transparency? So we contacted longtime law enforcement expert and now Kansas City private investigator John Underhill.
When he called in on the 911 call, he immediately said suicide. She committed suicide. Well, first of all, how did he know that?
We wanted this former California police chief's unbiased and educated thoughts on these case records and our unanswered questions to Marcus Hines, including why records don't show a ballistics test ever being done on the bullet.
That's like CSI 101. I mean, that's, you check the bullet and and you do a forensic analysis on the bullet itself and see if that gun is the same gun that was utilized there at the scene.
The gun itself was eventually dusted for prints and swabbed for DNA, but only some 18 months later after Martha's death. And records show, despite the documented history of abuse, Martha's hands nor Dennis Morgan's hands or clothes were ever tested for gun residue.
And that's what you do with these cases. If you've got a case like this, you've got to eliminate the possibility, because what's happening is some of these questions are asked after.
In order to have gunshot residue tests that are admissible in court is a very expensive test that has to be done through electron microscopy, and there has to be a high enough index of suspicion to do that, and they don't have a high enough.
Years of abuse, does it create suspicion?
There's always been suspicion, but they interviewed him. They went through his timeline. They looked at what he said he did.
Yeah, and that's the problem today. We have a lot of that occurring. A lot of evidence won't be processed because of the cost.
Which is why we're left with Denisa's doubt.
They didn't do any video, take any of the family members down for video questioning. They asked a couple questions at the scene of myself and my sister, and that was it.
Precariously balanced against the coroner's science.
I'm certain that Mr. Morgan is not a very nice man and that he may have caused her death. He may have psychologically tortured her or physically abused her to the point where she wanted to commit suicide. But all of the forensic evidence shows that he did not pull the trigger. She pulled the trigger.
In a case that may never go away for Denisa or the Shreveport Police Department.
When you don't complete a full investigation on the evidence that's brought forward, it's incomplete, and you're going to get this backlash.